It's the sound of ideas from 90.3 WCPN Idea Stream. I'm Mike McIntyre. Thanks so much for joining us. The plan to consolidate government into one regional umbrella in St. Louis fell apart last week. Leaders here interested in the efficiencies consolidation could bring had been following the St. Louis experiment closely and had seen it as a possible roadmap for what might happen here. And then it fell apart. St. Louis had made several attempts to consolidate since 1876, the year when the city was legally separated from the county by the Missouri legislature, something known as the Great Divorce. The plan there had been to combine the city and the county and convert 88 smaller cities, towns, and villages into municipal districts. The new single entity of St. Louis would have had a population of 1.3 million people with one elected mayor and 33 members of council. That effort was led by the nonprofit Better Together that formed in 2013. The 88 districts would have continued providing fire protection, trash, and park maintenance services, but the St. Louis government would have taken charge of policing and economic development and would have been funded with sales taxes that used to go to the individual communities. The plan also called for consolidating the nearly 80 municipal courts into one. Better Together claimed the merger would have saved the region nearly $1 billion by 2032, $1 billion a year, by eliminating redundancies. So why did the effort get shelved last week, and what lessons can Cleveland leaders take away from this? Today's conversation is part of Cleveland Connects, our ongoing community conversation about issues important to Northeast Ohio. Cleveland Connects is a partnership between IdeaStream, cleveland.com, and PNC Bank. You may have noticed yesterday on cleveland.com and in the Plain Dealer an extensive report on the St. Louis situation by cleveland.com public interest and advocacy reporter Peter Krause, who joins us now in Studio 4. Good to see you, Pete.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for being here. His coverage has been part of the series Cleveland 2030, A Way Forward, in the PD and online at cleveland.com. Rachel Littman also joins us for this conversation now. She's a reporter from St. Louis Public Radio, and she joins us on the phone from St. Louis. Thanks for calling in, Rachel.
Good morning, Mike. Thanks for having me.
Good morning. And Marty McGann is with us in Studio 4 as well. He's Senior Vice President of Advocacy with the Greater Cleveland Partnership, the local Chamber of Commerce that's in the beginning stages of looking at the idea of government consolidation here. Marty, very good to have you here, too.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you. If you'd like to join our conversation, weigh in right now. Is it possible? Could you imagine a Cuyahoga County and Cleveland combined, the individual communities not being as individual as they are now? You can weigh in with your thoughts at 866-578-0903. We can talk about some of the benefits and drawbacks. You can send us an email, soi@wcpn.org is the address, or you can tweet at Sound of Ideas. Rachel, it seemed just a few weeks ago like the Better Together effort was on a roll. There obviously had been some opposition and some discussion about that and debate, as there is in any kind of substantive policy change. But then it, as we mentioned, just fell apart last week. What's the main driver of that?
So I think there are a couple of things going on here that are a little bit unique to St. Louis than perhaps other regions. I don't think you can underestimate the impact that the legal troubles of now former St. Louis County Executive Steve Stanger had on this plan falling apart. He was initially supposed to be the first, we were terming it mega mayor. The language that was actually used is metropolitan mayor. And he would have essentially been allowed to stay on well past his elected term. So he would not have been elected to this post at first. The language was whoever was St. Louis County executive as of a specific date, January of 2019, would have taken over this post of being the first metropolitan mayor. Shortly after it was revealed that the federal government was investigating some contracting issues with his administration, the group backing this proposal, Better Together, or Unite STL, which was the political kind of action committee backing this, pulled back the petition. This was meant to be a statewide petition effort. They pulled back the petition to change some language so that he would not be the mega mayor, the metro mayor. Mm-hmm. He has now resigned and pleaded guilty to federal corruption charges, but I think there was a lot of concern of, is this the individual, the non-elected individual that you want in this post? Look at what is going on. Also, a lot of the concern with the St. Louis Economic Development Partnership. This was meant to be sort of a unified economic development entity. A lot of the corruption schemes went through there. So that is something that is that is rather unique to St. Louis, and that it was legal trouble. I think also what went on too was they just underestimated the pushback that they were going to get and who the pushback was going to be coming from. A lot of these now 88 or so municipalities are sort of a training ground for some African American leadership. They have local elected governmental power. It enables them to learn if they want to go up to statewide level offices or state representative offices, county level offices. And it is also very difficult to get elected county-wide across sort of both the city and the county with that population if you're an African American leader without sort of very specific conditions kind of coming into play. And that was a concern of it as well. Also, one of the big concerns was the fact that it had to be a statewide vote, that counties down in southeast Missouri around southwest Missouri around Joplin, or northeastern Missouri could have decided the fate of St. Louis and St. Louis County, even if voters there didn't approve it. But I think sort of what really triggered its collapse was just the issues with County Executive Steve Stanger. It kind of gave opponents another thing to point to that really, I think, was visceral for a lot of people.
Pete Krause went to St. Louis and did a lot of reporting on this topic, and one of the stories that I saw online was about black leaders, particularly. One of the points that Rachel just brought up was how they might have reacted to it, and in fact, a number of them came out against it very recently. What was the prevailing thought that you got from minority leaders and how they thought this might impact them and really the representation in the region?
Yeah, Mike. The African-American leaders in St. Louis were quite concerned that a merger of governments would dilute the representation, the African-American representation of the region. There was a St. Louis City Council, there's a Cuyahoga, or Board of Aldermen rather, there's a St. Louis County County Council, and they would have been combined into one 33-member Metro Council. And there was concern that 33-member Metro Council would not reflect the same percentage of African-American representation. Better Together sensed this, though, and they tried to do a few things to mitigate that. The number of the large number of council representatives was designed in part to ensure that it represented the demographics of the region so that African Americans would get elected. And also the large number of members was supposed to be able to allow for caucusing so that if there were particular interests, they could, groups could get together and press their concerns. But one thing that did happen, and there was concern the whole way around this, and then late in the game, the head of the local NAACP came out in favor of the merger. But at the same time it was revealed that he was on the payroll of Better Together. And that did not sit well, and it gave a very convenient argument for those who did oppose the merger to say, hey, look, this is not in the best interest of the minority community.
Marty McGann, I know you've been having conversations about this, and your organization and your members are interested in this kind of a conversation, but you're looking at sort of the pitfalls that would face anybody doing this. In a couple of these examples, sort of a little bit of shady dealings, that certainly turns people off, and sort of the conversation in general, too, of giving up power if you have that in a community, whether you're, regardless of who you are. What about the challenges ahead, and how do you hope this conversation here then goes forward?
Yeah, thanks again, Mike, for the opportunity to speak with you today. Those are all valid points, really a concern of our members as well, and understanding and ensuring that we approach this the right way and that we do the research that's necessary. We come at this from a data perspective. But I think what happened on the ground in St. Louis, at least from our examination, is due to the complications there, not because it was a bad idea generally. We've already talked a little bit about their structure, the process that they've used. They had some advantages, but it didn't fall apart because it wasn't a good idea. It didn't fall apart because it was because there aren't savings to be achieved by some degree of government consolidation. It failed because of the complications on the ground, because of the executive, because of failures to engage diverse communities, and because of the statewide vote. Absent those issues or approaching that differently, there's opportunity there. And we think if we structure this right with our members and have the right dialogue in our community, that we can arrive at a solution that's right for Cleveland. We don't prescribe exactly what that is. St. Louis had about 20 research studies they had. We're sitting on one with the tax study that we've completed in our organization. But there is something there if we continue examining this right.
Rachel, the studies that we're talking about with Marty McGann, or that he just mentioned, like 20 different studies. This was really a data-driven idea in St. Louis, and what it came to was that you would save a ton of money by not having duplication of services. Did people buy into that part of the argument, and the rest of it was really stuff on the ground? Did they believe in this in concept?
I think the idea that it would save money is kind of instinctual in that it is incredibly inefficient to have what is now 88 municipalities. At the time they began the study, it was 1991. It's inefficient to have different police departments. There are things that instinctively make sense about consolidating government functions. The issue was that they couldn't back up or provide any evidence that this would save $1 billion a year, that because you could find $1 billion worth of efficiencies in all of these governments. At some point, it just becomes you find the efficiencies, how do you keep finding more efficiencies? So it was the numbers and the specifics, I think, that led people to say continue to be even more skeptical about this idea. It gave them another reason to push back, another reason to say this is ridiculous, it will not be best for the region. There were a number of studies, reports of people saying this is essentially just going to bankrupt some of these entities because you're pulling away some of the tax revenue that funds these operations. A lot of these communities, the smaller municipalities, are very residential. They don't have a whole lot of sales tax entity. How are they going to be able to keep funding their services? It would eliminate a tax from the city of St. Louis that is a third of its budget. Now, yes, you'd be combining some municipal services, but they'd still have to continue to offer fire protection to fund their portion of the police protection, to fund trash, to fund water, things like that. So it was these claims that Better Together and Unite STL, these two groups, really couldn't back up with any numbers, with any real data or real research to show, yes, it would save $1 billion a year. That just led another angle of people to say, you're not actually doing this for the best of the region. The other thing I think, too, that I've often pointed out, and yes, schools and education would be a much more complicated lift than municipal governments or police departments or municipal courts, but they couch this in the language of equity and wanting to make the region more equitable. The schools are among some of the most unequal things within our region because of, the funding mechanism for it, which is mostly property tax, to not really get at the schools and to not really address a zoning issue either. I think it made it hard for some people to think this is actually being done for equity and not for this economic reason for the big backer of this proposal, something that was sort of an economic theory of his that he wanted to put into action.
We have an email from Patrick, not an encouraging one. He says, all the little fiefdoms around Cuyahoga County will oppose this forever. It's yet another wise idea that has no chance. That's Patrick's thought. Let's have a call now on line one. We have Judge Nancy First calling in. She's calling in from the Justice Center. Good to talk with you, Judge.
Yes. Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm just getting ready to go up to get court in session, but I was listening with great interest to this discussion, and I talked to Pete about it some couple months ago. I think that there are small ways. I can understand the political resistance that you see, and everybody seems to recognize that. My approach would be that to take small pieces of whatever it is that we could do. You see some of this in the water and sewer. They seem to be heading in that more regional direction. The opportunities for the courts would be in pretrial and probation services, mental health services, central booking, which has been on the table since I arrived in '97. We have some problems in the jail, but we could figure out a way to solve that. And for the courts perspective, we can accomplish what we need to do with buy-in from the municipal courts and the common pleas courts to find those areas where we are in duplication. The criminal law encourages that. So, we could. I think also that whatever happens, the local government funding is probably going to drive a lot of the conversation. But I say do what we can in small pieces and get the buy-in that you need to do as much as you can to save money and to increase the efficiencies and the equities in what we deliver.
Judge, thank you very much for the call. Appreciate that.
All right.
Pete Krause, you've been covering the regionalism and those issues. It's not as though there aren't attempts in Cuyahoga County. There are some, but even some of these small things we find then are difficult to implement.
Oh, it's very hard to implement. I've been writing over the last year or two about whether or not it would be smart to merge all the municipal courts in the county. I don't know how much the powers that be are taking that seriously, but it would be an incredibly difficult thing to pull off. One thing I was talking to the mayor of South Euclid, Georgine Whalen, the other day about the whole idea of a major unification of this community, and she was saying, and she's all for it, but she was saying that the political will does not exist here right now, whether it's at the local level or even at the state level. To pull something like this off, to pull off what St. Louis was trying to do here locally, you would have to have all the legislators on board, and the politics of this are so complex right now that you really need some strong leaders who can articulate the benefits if something like this is going to happen, because the pushback will be enormous.
Our number, once again, 216-578-0903. Call in now to weigh in on this idea of sort of creating a unigov, a combined government for Cuyahoga County, something they were trying to do in St. Louis, which fell apart last week, and we're discussing the reasons that happened and maybe some of the lessons Cleveland can learn. 216-578-0903, or email is soi@wcpn.org. As always, you can tweet at Sound of Ideas. That's what Hannah Lebovitz did. And she says, we have similar concerns in Cuyahoga County to the ones Rachel mentioned. The county executive's administration, the growth of African-American leadership in the suburbs. These are systemic concerns related to applying this, quote, good idea to any Midwest region. She said we also have mostly residential suburbs. We also have increased poverty in the suburbs. East Cleveland and Ferguson have numerous similarities. We have inequitable school districts. Listening to Rachel, we could easily be describing Cuyahoga County. So certainly some similarities there, and I appreciate the thoughts on that, Hannah. What about that, Marty? We seem very similar to St. Louis when we're having this conversation. There are other communities to look to. I know you went to St. Louis to try to learn what was going on. Since then, as we've mentioned, it's not happening. So do you go back and do a postmortem there? Do you then turn your attention to Indianapolis or other places where this kind of regionalism may have fared better? How are you moving forward?
Both. We need to examine what happened in St. Louis to understand exactly what happened. I mean, we talked about the 3 data points on the ground, but I think there's a lot to learn there from the research and the work that they did over the course of 5 or 6 years, how they approached that research, who funded that research, how they got that done. But St. Louis is just one example. It's one data point. It's the most relevant topical one now for reasons that you mentioned regarding a lot of similarities in data. Their county employment's about the same. Their county GDP is about the same. Their growth in that community is about the same as ours. So there's a lot of similarities. But again, it's only one data point. Going to Indianapolis, going to Nashville, understanding how this has been done in the past is another way to look at this. From our perspective, it's kind of an education and a listening tour on the front end. But we're not prescribing the exact result. We're not prescribing Unigov necessarily on the back end. We need to have discussions in our community and engage partners to figure out what is possible and what would be helpful to our community. The status quo that we have in this community is not sustainable from a tax standpoint. The growth that we've had over the course of the last several years, we've supported in some ways at the Greater Cleveland Partnership, but that trend line is not sustainable, and we need to think about systemic changes if we're gonna be able to support what's needed in our community.
And Mike, just to jump in, I think there's a lot of opportunities for sharing of resources, sharing of tax base. Companies like to go where they're treated the best, but that's not always the best for the municipalities. And I've talked to heads of local governments who think that it would be a good idea to have tax sharing, so that if a company decides to go from one city to the next, that the city that loses the business doesn't lose out on the tax. There's all kinds of opportunities for resource sharing. But again, you have to have the will to do that.
Also in our conversation is Rachel Lippman. She's a reporter from St. Louis Public Radio. Rachel, what about these smaller types of regional efforts in St. Louis and St. Louis County? Are they doing that there, and have you seen some success there? And what are the chances of sort of incremental progress?
They are working on it a little bit in the sense that there are ways that cities can combine themselves. You've seen that up in sort of the North County region where a lot of these small municipalities are. Little cities combining with even littler cities. They've done some combination of policing resources up in that area as well. They have administratively combined some of their municipal courts. They can't actually dissolve their municipal courts. You, I think, are required by state law if you are a city of a certain size to have these municipal court facilities, but they have administratively combined into one location with professional court staff, professional clerks, those kind of things. A lot of that came out of the post-Ferguson, post-Michael Brown era with the Justice Department report that found these courts are incredibly predatory for these residents up there in terms of that's how these communities funded a lot of their budget. You had the effort with the St. Louis Economic Development Partnership to attempt to kind of create a regional economic development strategy. Just the way that was structured, though, it put St. Louis County very much in charge of it. The county executive had most of the appointments. And again, with all of his legal troubles, that has been it kind of discredited in the minds of a lot of people. We do have that as Peter mentioned, and both Peter and Marty mentioned, this sort of tax swapping where, a store moves 3 miles down the road to take advantage of tax incentives that another city is offering. So again, instinctually, this idea that, putting economic development it kind of in a unified way makes sense. But especially now that the Economic Development Partnership is caught up in some of this legal issues, is just going to make it a lot more difficult. And that is what you hear. However, a lot of people say is that this needs to, mergers need to happen at a local level. It needs to be something that these local groups want to do. That you cannot force it on these cities. So they would point to these mergers that are going on at this kind of really micro level to say, yes, look, there is the will to change, but is it actually changing sort of, real, is the underlying issue? Probably not.
Let's have Tom in West Park join our conversation now. Tom, welcome to the show.
Hi. Yeah, thanks. Appreciate it. I used to live in St. Louis. Well, actually, I used to live in a St. Louis suburb of Florissant about 20 years ago. And St. Louis is as good as it would be to consolidate county government like Indianapolis or Nashville. St. Louis has one distinction that Cleveland doesn't have. St. Louis City is not a subdivision, political subdivision of St. Louis County. They're two separate entities. St. Louis City is an independent entity that broke off from the county, a century ago or more. And like in Cleveland, the county seat is Cleveland. The county government is based in Cleveland. In St. Louis, the county government is based in Clayton. They're two separate things. As a suburbanite of St. Louis 20 years ago, I don't, and thinking now, I don't know how many suburbanites actually want to take on the problems of St. Louis City. You know what I'm saying? I don't think it's the same thing. There is really no duplication of government between the two sets of the county and city government in St. Louis, the way there is a duplication in Cuyahoga County and Cleveland for certain things. So right. I'm not sure it's an apples and, I'm not sure it's a quite comparable comparison. Yeah.
Gotcha. All right. Hey, thanks so much for the call, Tom. What about the geography? The idea that the county seat is in Cleveland, and so that may make it a little more, at least in terms of thought, about it being the centralized place where you could seat government for the entire county.
Well, and what the caller said is true. In fact, when I was out there, I stayed near Clayton, and Clayton has its own downtown. There are two downtowns to the St. Louis region. One is for the St. Louis County government, and the other is for the, what we think of St. Louis, down where the arch is and the ball field and everything. And it's true, St. Louis, the city of St. Louis is totally separate from St. Louis County. In fact, the city of St. Louis, to make it even more complicated, is a county in and of itself, which comes with more positions that they must have elected positions by state mandate. So that makes it even more complicated. But I do think there are still comparisons. I mean, there are still things that, for instance, we have a city council and we have a county council. We have two bodies of government here in Cuyahoga County, one for the city of Cleveland and one for the entire county. Now, there is obviously overlap, but there's still a lot of duplication that goes on. There could be a lot more coordination between Cleveland and the suburbs. So while the caller is correct, I do think that there are a lot of similarities in what can be learned.
Rachel, in the plan in St. Louis, the communities were still communities. They were municipal districts, and they were still going to do some of the services that a local municipality does. It wouldn't do police services or some others, but it would still do trash and other things. Was that a concession to the idea that people wouldn't go for the whole enchilada, the idea that we have one government and it's in downtown St. Louis or Clayton or wherever it might be, but that is our government? Instead, we still needed to hold on to these municipal districts. Was it a concession to that? And in that way, was it not really the sort of the full regionalism that some might talk about?
That's kind of one way of looking at it as a concession. The fundamental thing is that you took away most of the functions of a municipal government. Yes, they were able to keep parks. Yes, they were able to keep libraries. Yes, they were able to keep, if they ran their own trash service. There's actually a municipality in the region that has its own utility. But it took away basically every other taxing authority. Sales tax, property tax, those kind of things all got sent to this central government. So you could view it as a concession, as a way for people to sort of retain their regional identity as, oh, I live in the municipal district of Kirkwood, but it was more window dressing than an actual concession. Most of what we think of as government functions were completely centralized at this location. Municipal courts, policing, really what we think of as being core government services.
And Mike, if I could just add
Please do.
Two other things in that regard. With the municipalities, a lot of them had debt. They had outstanding bonds that they had to pay, and I think if they were to merge all the municipalities into one entity, that would have been a very difficult proposition to take all those outstanding bond issues and combine them into one. This is so I was told. But the other thing too about the policing, and that was a big part of this, is they were going to take 55 municipal police departments and combine them into one. You would have had the city police force, the St. Louis police force, the St. Louis County police force, and then 53 other municipal police forces. And the thinking was that this was going to provide much more equitable police protection across the region. It would have helped a lot of counties where their police departments are considered very, very dysfunctional. So I think there was a lot of value in that. And I think even a lot of those who opposed this plan for certain reasons, the statewide vote issue, the Steve Stenger effect, even the African-American representation, even those folks looked at the merging of the police departments and said, there's a good chance that this could help out and provide for much more accountability and quality of service.
Marty McGann, given all of this, given the troubles that were on the ground, the issues with combining police forces, the issues with minority representation, where do you take the conversation from here? As you mentioned, you need more data. You have one study that you're pointing to and saying this makes us less competitive. There's people that can debate the ins and outs of that particular study too. But do we need more study? Do you need to start opening up a conversation that says, here's why this matters to you? What's the next step for your organization?
Again, both. We will engage in a listening and education tour over the course of the next several months. We've already been meeting with a number of partners locally, number of organizations, elected officials, public officials, philanthropy, diverse communities and diverse organizations. So have some of those listening sessions and talk with them about what's possible, what's missing, what ought we examine next, and then engage in a dialogue with folks in the community about that, help shape what an examination could be and an analysis to move forward. Is it discussions around the opportunity cost of the money that is not available because we have some redundancy similar to what St. Louis had? Is it an examination over local government fund? We've heard a lot of discussion that you don't have an apples-to-apples comparison in some of these communities because of revenue sharing between state and local communities. So there's a lot of different ways to take this debate and to take this examination. For us, it's trying to figure out what the scope of that is over the course of the next 3 or 4 months.
To that end, Patrick, via Twitter says, so long as the state government keeps cutting funding to regional and municipal government, it'll be incredibly difficult to convince those entities to give up control over agencies and functions which generate revenue, even if there are potential cost savings. Interesting point, and one that certainly should be discussed more. And as we wrap the conversation quickly, Rachel, I mentioned what the next steps are in Cleveland, but we've been following St. Louis here because of Pete's reporting. What are the next steps in St. Louis? Is this a done deal and dead, or can we see a revival of something like this plan?
I think the Better Together plan, as it was originally outlined, this statewide petition effort, is dead. There's a lot of resistance to the idea that, southeast or northwest Missouri decides the fate of St. Louis and St. Louis County. There's also a legislative effort to ensure that it wouldn't happen by asking voters to approve a constitutional amendment that would say if you try to do this merger anywhere else, that the affected entities would have to approve it to take effect. What seems the most likely is that the individuals who have been pushing for this idea of a unigov, this Better Together proposal, will attempt to give a body that already exists in concept called the Board of Freeholders more authority to negotiate this at the local level. As it stands right now, this Board of Freeholders, who has members appointed by the mayor, the county executive, they can negotiate some municipal government and territory changes, but they can't make wholesale structural reforms. The thinking is that they'll go to the legislature or do an initiative petition process to get a proposal on the ballot that would give the Board of Freeholders more authority to do this negotiated at the local level without having to go to a statewide vote. But this initial proposal that was outlined in January is likely dead.
Rachel Lippman, appreciate your time. Reporter from St. Louis Public Radio. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
And Marty McGann, Senior Vice President of Advocacy with the Greater Cleveland Partnership. Good to have you here today as well.
Thanks, Mike.
And Peter Krause, the public interest and public advocacy reporter for cleveland.com. Appreciate your reporting on this topic.
Thanks, Mike.
And Pete's reporting and this conversation are part of Cleveland Connects, our ongoing community conversation about issues important to Northeast Ohio. Cleveland Connects is a partnership between IdeaStream, cleveland.com, and PNC Bank. We're going to take a quick break right now, and when we come back after the break, it's the end of the school year, and schools are collecting on unpaid lunch debt. While some schools resort to what's being termed lunch shaming to get paid, some communities are raising funds to help families out. We'll talk more right after the break. It's The Sound of Ideas. I'm Mike McIntyre.